You think I'm just a waitress, don't you? Jessica asked, her voice steady, though every muscle in her body tensed as she glanced over at Nathan, the billionaire CEO's son. The room went quiet, the music fading into the background, the flickering candlelight casting a soft glow across their faces. The sound of clinking glasses and hushed conversations halted, and all eyes were on her, waiting for the moment to unfold. Nathan, sitting alone in the corner of the extravagant restaurant, looked up at her with a mix of surprise and uncertainty. She had seen him earlier, his face hidden behind the cold mask of someone who had long since given up on fitting into the world around him. Yet tonight something felt different. It wasn't the grand chandeliers or the gold-rimmed glasses that defined the atmosphere of this elite gathering. No, it was the weight of isolation that hung heavily in the air. And Nathan, with his broken spirit and quiet desperation, was its embodiment. Jessica had seen it before, the way the wealthy treated those who served them as invisible, replaceable. But she didn't let the sting of her own experiences shape her view of the world. She had learned to keep her head high, no matter how low others tried to push her. The insults, the dismissals, they were nothing new. But the eyes of Nathan, filled with an ache she couldn't ignore, made her stop in her tracks. He wasn't just any privileged son of a billionaire. There was pain there, hidden beneath the layers of polished arrogance and cold detachment. He didn't belong in this room, not in the way the others did. Not because he wasn't wealthy enough, no, he was drowning in wealth, but because he had been abandoned by it. Jessica knew what it felt like to be abandoned. She had learned to survive, to fight, to be strong when no one cared to notice. But Nathan was different. He was the son of Derek Williams, a man who commanded a fortune built on ruthless deals and cutthroat ambition. Derek's cold stare was as unforgiving as the empire he had built, and Jessica could see that in Nathan's eyes. The weight of his father's expectations had crushed him long before he stepped into the room tonight. And now Nathan was here, trapped in a life where he couldn't find solace. Jessica wasn't just going to walk away. She wasn't just going to let him sit there broken and ignored. She knew she had to do something to break through the walls that had kept him isolated, something to show him that he was worth more than just the money he was born into. Slowly, she walked over to him, the soft click of her shoes against the marble floor the only sound that filled the tense silence. She stood in front of him, her gaze unwavering. "Would you like to dance?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Nathan blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected offer. For a moment he didn't respond, his eyes flickering between the people around him and then back to Jessica, as if he couldn't quite believe she was standing there, offering him something no one else had. His hands, which had been clenched tightly on his lap, slowly relaxed. The vulnerability in his eyes deepened. "You want to dance with me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica nodded, offering a small but genuine smile. "Yes," she said, "because no one else seems to see you. But I do." She held out her hand to him. Nathan hesitated for a moment longer, his breath shallow, as if he were afraid of what would happen next. The crowd around them had fallen silent, watching this unexpected interaction unfold, unsure of how to react. And then, with a slow but deliberate motion, Nathan placed his hand in hers. The moment their fingers touched, everything else in the room seemed to disappear. It wasn't the music or the crowd or the grand restaurant. It was just them, two people finding something real in a world built on facades. As they moved to the center of the room, Jessica felt the weight of their shared isolation. The world may have thought they were worlds apart, one a billionaire's son, the other just a waitress, but in that moment they were equals. Their dance was a quiet rebellion, a refusal to stay invisible, to let the world continue its slow, suffocating march without a second thought for those left behind. With each step, they moved further away from the expectations of their world. Nathan's stiff posture began to soften, and for the first time that evening, he smiled, genuine, unguarded. The tears in his eyes were not just from the pain of the past, but from the realization that someone had finally seen him for who he truly was, beyond the wealth and the scars. Jessica's heart beat faster, not because she was dancing with a billionaire's son, but because in that moment, they were both finding something they'd lost, themselves. The music flowed softly in the background, but it was no longer the center of attention. Nathan and Jessica continued to dance in the quiet corner of the room, and as they moved together, The tension that had gripped Nathan seemed to dissipate. For the first time that evening, he wasn't the son of a billionaire, bound by expectations and judgment. He was just a man dancing with someone who saw him. Jessica led him across the polished floor, her grip firm yet gentle, guiding him as if she knew exactly where they needed to go. The feeling between them was unexpected, almost electric, a silent understanding that connected them without words. Nathan, who had spent so many years hiding behind the walls his father had built around him, finally let go. He had been taught to show no weakness, to always be perfect, to never let anyone see how much he hurt inside. But tonight, in this moment, he was allowed to be vulnerable. The rhythm of the dance brought a sense of release that he didn't even know he needed. He looked at Jessica, who was focused on him, her expression calm, yet there was something in her eyes, a depth of understanding. She had no reason to be kind to him. In her world she was just a waitress and he was the heir to an empire. But tonight she saw beyond all of that. "I never thought I'd be here," Nathan whispered, his voice almost lost in the music. Jessica's gaze softened. "Where?" she asked, her voice soothing. "In a room full of people, surrounded by all this wealth, and still feel so alone." He looked around, almost as if the words had slipped out before he could stop them. "It's like I'm not even part of it. Like I'm just here. Not even visible." Jessica gave a slight nod, understanding more than he realized. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, feeling the weight of his words. She had seen this before, people who had everything yet still felt empty. The loneliness that came with too much power, too many expectations. "You're visible now," she finally said, her voice gentle but firm. Nathan looked at her, searching her face for any hint of mockery, but there was none. Just sincerity. "How did you learn that?" he asked, genuinely curious. Jessica didn't respond right away. Instead, she let the dance continue, letting the movement speak for her. It wasn't something you could teach. It wasn't something you could plan. It was a lesson she had learned the hard way. Over the years she had learned to let go of the things that didn't matter. People's opinions, the judgment of others. What mattered was staying true to herself, finding moments of peace and joy, even in the smallest of things. The music slowly faded, and as they came to a stop, Nathan was still holding her hand, not wanting to let go. The room was still, almost as if the world had paused for just a moment, leaving them in their own space, their own time. But as the applause began to fill the air, Nathan slowly pulled away. His expression changed. The confident mask he had worn all evening was back. Yet there was a subtle shift in his eyes, something softer, something more human. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd find this kind of moment here." Jessica smiled, her eyes meeting his one last time. "You found it because you allowed yourself to." She turned and walked away, leaving Nathan standing there, a new understanding settling deep within him. The night had been a blur of wealth and status, but it was the quiet moments that made it real. And as he watched her disappear into the crowd, Nathan knew that this was a story he would never forget. The night had unfolded like a quiet storm, but the air now felt lighter, as if a new chapter was being written, one that none of them had anticipated. Nathan stood by the window, staring out at the lights of the city below. The view from this penthouse was breathtaking, a sweeping expanse of San Francisco's skyline. Yet, in the silence of the moment, it was clear he wasn't seeing the view. His mind was elsewhere, caught in a storm of its own. The dance had done something to him. He couldn't explain it, but he felt different. There was a shift inside him, a crack in the armor he had worn for so long. He hadn't let anyone in, not like that. Not in years. The door to the room opened and Jessica stepped in, her presence grounding him. She had walked away after the dance, but something had told her to return. She didn't know why, not really. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was just the feeling that something important had happened tonight, something worth seeing through. "Nathan," she said softly, breaking the silence. He turned to face her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He looked different now, softer, more human. For the first time, Jessica could see him without the weight of his family's expectations bearing down on him. "I thought you'd left," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and something else, something that hadn't been there before. I was about to, she replied, taking a step closer. But something told me to come back. They stood there for a moment just looking at each other. There was no need for words. The dance had said everything. You're not who I thought you were, Nathan said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, but there was an honesty in it that made Jessica's heart race. And what did you think I was? She asked, intrigued by the vulnerability in his eyes. Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair as he walked over to the small bar in the corner of the room. I don't know. I guess I thought you were just another waitress. He paused, turning to face her. I never realized how much of a wall I've built around myself. But tonight, he trailed off, unsure of how to put it into words. Jessica watched him, waiting. Tonight something changed, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure if it was the dance, or the way she had looked at him, or how he had felt seen for the first time in a long while. You didn't look at me like I was just a CEO's son, he continued. You looked at me like I was a person. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She didn't respond immediately, not because she didn't know what to say, but because there was something in his words that felt too raw, too real. It wasn't about the power or the wealth or the prestige. It was about the connection they had shared, a simple, unspoken understanding. He did know was that he couldn't go back. He couldn't unsee what Jessica had shown him, himself just as he was. It had been a week since that night, and Nathan had decided to stop by the restaurant where Jessica worked. He had no plan, no agenda, he just needed to see her again. When he walked in, the soft hum of conversation filled the space. It was a busy night as usual, with people seated at tables enjoying their meals. But the moment he entered, something felt different. It was as if the world outside had faded away. He spotted Jessica at the far end of the room, balancing a tray in her hands, moving effortlessly between tables. She was exactly as he remembered, graceful, confident, but with an air of calm that made everything around her feel still. As he walked toward her, his heart raced. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the familiarity of the place, or maybe it was just the fact that he hadn't been able to stop thinking about her. When she saw him approaching, a soft smile spread across her face, and Nathan couldn't help but feel a warmth spread through him. Nathan, she said, her voice calm but filled with warmth. What brings you here tonight? I don't know, he said, slightly embarrassed by how unsure he sounded. I just wanted to see you. She raised an eyebrow, clearly amused, but her eyes softened. I'm glad you did. Nathan stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. He wanted to talk to her, to share how much things had changed since their night together. But the words felt trapped in his chest. He had always been good at business, at dealing with the numbers, the figures, the endless cycle of work. But when it came to this real connection, real emotion, he felt out of his depth. Jessica's smile never faded, and she tilted her head slightly, as if sensing his discomfort. It's all right, she said gently. You don't have to say anything if you're not ready. But I'm glad you're here. Nathan let out a breath, the tension in his shoulders easing just a bit. I guess I've been running from myself for a long time, he admitted, his voice quiet. And it took meeting you to realize how much I've been hiding. Jessica didn't say anything at first. Instead she just nodded, as if she understood everything without him needing to explain further. It's not easy to let go of everything we think defines us, she said, her tone soft, yet filled with a wisdom that took Nathan by surprise. But you don't have to do it alone. The words settled into Nathan's mind, and for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. He wasn't sure where this path would take him, or what the future held, but for once he wasn't afraid to take the first step. He had spent so many years living for others, for the expectations of a life that wasn't his own. But now he was ready to live for himself. And in that moment, standing in the soft light of the restaurant with Jessica, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. For everything. Jessica smiled again, this time with a knowing look in her eyes. You don't have to thank me, she said, her voice light but sincere. You just have to be you. Nathan stood there for a moment longer, taking in the words before turning to leave. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, he knew that this was only the beginning. He had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time he wasn't walking it alone. The weeks that followed felt like a new chapter in Nathan's life. He had begun to change, and for the first time, he felt like the weight of the world wasn't pressing down on his shoulders. The meetings and negotiations that used to dominate his days no longer felt as important as they once had. There was a freedom in his heart now, a sense of liberation from the expectations of his father, from the life he had been living. He was learning to take small steps toward the man he wanted to become, not the one everyone expected him to be. Jessica had become a quiet anchor in his life. He didn't need to see her every day, but just knowing she was there, that she saw him for who he really was, gave him a sense of calm he had never known before. Their connection had become a comforting constant. Some nights, after a long day of meetings or business trips, Nathan found himself walking to the restaurant where Jessica worked, just to sit with her for a while, share a cup of coffee and talk about anything and everything. He didn't need to discuss business or his father, or the empire he was supposed to inherit. They just talked about life. She shared stories about her daughter, how she had learned to juggle 1,000 things at once, never complaining. He talked about the small joys he was beginning to appreciate, the sound of rain on the windows, the warmth of a good meal, the quiet satisfaction of being seen and understood. One evening, as Nathan sat across from Jessica, he realized that the quiet moments with her had become the highlight of his week. There was no pressure, no pretense, just a real connection that made him feel grounded. "You've changed, Nathan," Jessica said softly, her eyes meeting his. "I can see it in the way you carry yourself, the way you speak. You're not hiding anymore." He looked down at his hands, his fingers wrapped around the coffee mug. "I don't know if I've changed completely," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But I'm learning to live for myself, not just for everyone else's expectations." Jessica smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "That's the hardest part. To stop living for the image others have of you, and start living for the person you truly are." Nathan nodded, his gaze meeting hers. He hadn't realized until now how much he had been running from himself. For so long he had let the pressure of his family's legacy define him, but now he was starting to see that he didn't have to carry that weight alone. He could build his own path, make his own choices, and it felt good. As the weeks passed, Nathan and Jessica continued to grow closer. They weren't rushing anything. They were simply allowing their bond to develop naturally without force. Nathan had learned to stop trying to control every part of his life, to let go of the need for constant validation. For the first time he felt like he could breathe. One evening as they sat together at the restaurant, the soft hum of conversation surrounding them, Nathan reached across the table and took Jessica's hand in his. She looked up surprised, but there was no fear in her eyes. Just warmth. "I don't know what the future holds," Nathan said, his voice steady. "But I know I want you to be a part of it." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected those words, but they filled her with a sense of joy she couldn't quite explain. "I'm glad to hear that," she replied softly, "because I think you're finally beginning to see the person you've always been." Nathan smiled, his eyes reflecting a newfound clarity. "I think I'm just starting to see him too." In that moment, as they sat together, hands intertwined, Nathan realized something important. He didn't have to live up to anyone else's expectations. He didn't have to be the person his father wanted him to be. He could be himself, and that was enough. He had found something more valuable than wealth or status. He had found peace within himself, and the person who could help him keep it was sitting right across from him. Weeks passed, and Nathan began to feel a sense of ease he hadn't known in years. The weight of his family's expectations no longer held him captive. The constant pressure to perform, to be the perfect heir to his father's empire, started to fade into the background. It wasn't easy and it wasn't quick, but each day he felt more and more like the man he was meant to be, not the man everyone else expected him to be. Jessica had become a constant in his life, not just as someone he could talk to, but as someone who had helped him see a version of himself he had never allowed himself to believe in. She had shown him that being vulnerable didn't make him weak, it made him human. And for the first time he was starting to feel comfortable in his own skin. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and calls with investors, Nathan found himself once again walking into the familiar doors of the restaurant where Jessica worked. He had no particular reason for being there, but somehow it felt right. The restaurant had become a safe space for him, a place where he could just be himself, away from the pressures of the business world. He spotted her almost immediately, moving gracefully between tables, her eyes focused on the task at hand. There was something about the way she carried herself that made everything else around her seem quieter, more manageable. Nathan approached the counter, and as she turned to see him, a warm smile spread across her face. "Nathan," she said, her voice calm but filled with genuine warmth. "What brings you here tonight?" He chuckled softly, running a hand through his hair. "I guess I just wanted to see you," he said, his tone light but sincere. "It's been a long day." "I understand," Jessica replied, nodding as she wiped her hands on her apron. "It's been a long one for me too." They stood there for a moment, the space between them filled with an easy silence. Nathan felt like he could breathe here in this moment. It wasn't about expectations or obligations. It was just them, two people finding comfort in the simplest of connections. "I've been thinking," Nathan said after a while, his voice quieter this time, "about what you said to me that night we danced." Jessica raised an eyebrow, curious. "What about it?" "You said I didn't have to do everything alone. That I could find peace by being myself." Nathan paused, taking a deep breath. "I think you were right. I've spent so long trying to be what everyone else wanted, that I forgot what it felt like to just be me. To live for myself, not for the world around me." Jessica's expression softened, and she stepped a little closer. "I'm glad you're starting to see that," she said gently. "It's the hardest thing to do, but it's also the most freeing." Nathan nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "I'm starting to realize that I've been running away from the person I was meant to be. But now I want to face him. I want to be more than just the son of Derek Williams. I want to be Nathan, the person who chooses his own path." The words felt powerful as they left his lips, and for the first time, Nathan truly believed them. He wasn't sure what the future would bring, but he knew that he couldn't continue living for others. He had to live for himself. "You've already started that journey," Jessica said, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "And it's a beautiful thing to see." Nathan smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Thank you," he said quietly, the gratitude in his voice palpable. "For helping me see that. For helping me see me." Jessica's smile widened, and in that moment, Nathan realized just how much she had changed his life. It wasn't the wealth, the power, or the status that had made a difference. It was the simple act of being seen, of being understood. He hadn't expected it to come from a waitress, someone who had been cast aside by society's expectations. But here they were, two people who had found something real in a world that often made them feel invisible. And for the first time in a long time, Nathan didn't feel alone. He felt like he had a future. And it was his to choose. The months passed, and with each day, Nathan continued to feel the shift inside him. The changes were subtle at first, but undeniable. He no longer found himself consumed by the weight of his family's expectations, or the need to prove himself in the corporate world. Slowly, the idea of being true to himself, of embracing who he truly was, became less of a struggle and more of a natural part of his life. He found himself waking up in the mornings not with dread, but with a sense of purpose. He had begun to make decisions based on what felt right, not what he thought would be expected of him. And Jessica was still there, quietly supporting him, not as a crutch but as a companion. It wasn't a dramatic change, but rather a soft, continuous unfolding. Every time they met, whether for a quiet dinner or a simple walk in the park, it felt like they were building something real, something grounded in mutual respect and understanding. One evening, as Nathan walked into the restaurant where Jessica worked, he couldn't help but smile. It had become a second home to him, a place where he could escape from the outside world and simply be himself. He spotted her across the room, moving with the same graceful confidence that had first drawn him to her. She looked up and saw him standing there, and for a moment their eyes locked. It was a simple, unspoken moment, but it meant everything. "Hey," Nathan said, walking up to her. "I was hoping you'd be here tonight." "I always am," Jessica replied with a small smile, the warmth in her eyes never wavering. "What's on your mind?" Nathan hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to put it into words. But he didn't need to think too much about it. He just let the words come. I've been thinking about everything. About how much I've changed, how much we've changed. And I realized something. He paused, looking down for a moment before meeting her gaze again. I want more of this. I want more of these moments. Jessica's smile softened, and she stepped a little closer. I think I've been wanting the same thing, she said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need. Their shared connection, the understanding that had grown between them over the past few months, was more than enough. Nathan had come to realize that the world he had once been part of, the world of power, wealth and status, wasn't as important as he had once believed. What mattered now was the present, the people who truly cared for him, and the life he was finally beginning to create for himself. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of it. Do you ever wonder what comes next? Nathan asked, his voice soft as he looked at Jessica. Every day, she replied, her smile warm. But I've come to learn that what matters is not what's ahead, but who we are in this moment. And right now we're exactly where we need to be. Nathan nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. He didn't need to figure everything out right away. He didn't need to have a plan for the next 10 years. All he needed was to be present, to live in the moment, and to continue moving forward with the people who mattered. As they stood there, in the quiet of the restaurant, Nathan realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't rushing. He wasn't chasing an image or a future that someone else had built for him. He was finally building his own path. And Jessica, the woman who had been there for him from the very beginning, was going to be a part of that journey. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be challenges ahead. But Nathan knew with certainty that whatever came next, he was ready for it. He was no longer defined by the expectations of others. He was defined by who he was becoming, and that was enough. The following weeks unfolded like a dream Nathan wasn't sure he deserved, yet it felt more real than anything he had ever experienced. He had come a long way from the man he had been, the man who had been so consumed by duty and the expectations of others that he had lost sight of himself. With Jessica by his side, he was learning to trust, to live in the moment, and to let go of the burdens he had carried for so long. The nights they spent together became a sanctuary, a place where he could finally breathe. They didn't need to talk about the past or the future all the time. Sometimes just sitting in silence, sharing a cup of coffee or taking a quiet walk was enough. It wasn't about grand gestures or moments of fame. It was about simplicity, about being present in a world that often demanded so much. Nathan had been back to the restaurant several times since that first evening, and each time it felt more like home. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone here. It was just him, Jessica, and the quiet understanding that had blossomed between them. One evening as they sat together in the familiar booth by the window, the soft glow of the city outside casting a warm light on the table, Nathan found himself looking at Jessica with a new sense of clarity. He had never truly seen her until now. Not just as the waitress, the woman who had shown him kindness, but as someone who had made him realize the importance of living authentically. I've been thinking, he said, his voice quiet but steady, about everything we've shared, about how much you've changed my life. Jessica raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but her smile never wavered. How so? She asked. Nathan took a deep breath, his hands wrapped around his cup of coffee. I never realized how much of myself I had been hiding. For years I lived for the image others had of me. I lived to be what my father wanted, what my family expected, what the world demanded. And I lost myself in that. He paused, looking at her, his eyes softening. But with you it's different. You've shown me that I don't have to be anyone other than who I am. You've made me realize that it's okay to be vulnerable, to be human, to make mistakes and learn from them. Jessica listened intently, her gaze unwavering. She had always known that Nathan had a depth to him that he hadn't allowed himself to explore. You've always had it in you, she said quietly, her voice full of warmth. You just needed someone to remind you that it was okay to let go. To stop being afraid of what you might find if you looked inside yourself. Nathan nodded slowly, absorbing her words. I think I've been afraid for so long. Afraid of disappointing people, afraid of failing. But I'm starting to see that the only person I need to be true to is myself. Jessica's smile grew wider, and for a moment she just looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time too. That's the hardest part, Nathan. But once you get there, everything else falls into place. Nathan leaned back in the booth, feeling a sense of peace he had never known. It wasn't about finding perfection or having everything figured out. It was about embracing who he was, flaws and all. He didn't need to be anyone else. He didn't need to follow a path that others had set for him. He could carve his own way, and that was enough. I'm grateful, Nathan said, his voice full of emotion. Grateful for you, for this, for everything. You've given me something I never thought I'd find, peace. Jessica reached across the table, her hand brushing against his. You've always had it inside you, she said gently. You just had to believe in yourself. As they sat there in the quiet of the restaurant, Nathan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was chasing something. He wasn't trying to prove himself or live up to anyone's expectations. He was simply living, and that was enough. He didn't know what the future held, but with Jessica by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. And that was the most freeing feeling of all. The following months were a testament to how much Nathan had grown. He didn't have all the answers, but he was no longer afraid to ask the right questions. He had come to realize that life wasn't about avoiding challenges, but about facing them with a sense of purpose and authenticity. The business world, once his entire focus, had started to feel distant. He no longer measured his worth by the size of his deals or the success of his company. Instead, he started to measure it by how true he could stay to himself, and how much he could give to the people who mattered most. Jessica had remained by his side through it all, never pushing him to change faster than he was ready for. Her presence had become a grounding force in his life. She hadn't just helped him rediscover himself. She had shown him what it meant to truly live. One afternoon, Nathan stood on the balcony of his penthouse, watching the city below. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden hue over the skyline. The view was beautiful, but what struck him more than the view itself was the feeling inside him. There was peace now. A peace he hadn't known before. The world around him hadn't changed, but the way he saw it had. He had learned to stop running, to stop seeking approval from others, and to simply be. And that had made all the difference. A knock on the door broke his thoughts, and he turned to see Jessica standing there, a smile on her face as she stepped into the room. You've been quiet today, she said, her voice light, as if sensing the deep thoughts that had been occupying his mind. Nathan smiled, his heart light. Just thinking, he replied, about how much things have changed, about how much I've changed. Jessica walked over to him, standing beside him at the balcony's edge. For a moment they both stood there in silence, taking in the view. It wasn't necessary to speak, as the connection between them had deepened in ways words couldn't capture. I've been thinking about the future, Nathan continued after a while. I know I can't predict everything, but I feel like I'm finally in control of my own path. And I want to make sure it's a path that's true to who I am, not what anyone else wants me to be. Jessica's gaze softened, and she placed a hand gently on his arm. That's the most important thing, she said. To know who you are and be proud of that. To walk your own path, not because it's easy, but because it's yours. Nathan turned to her, his eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you, he said. You've been my anchor, Jessica. I know I've still got a lot to figure out, but I finally feel like I'm heading in the right direction. Her smile deepened and she squeezed his arm lightly. You've always had it in you, Nathan. You just needed to believe in yourself. Nathan took a deep breath, letting the calm wash over him. There was still so much to learn, so much to experience, but for the first time he wasn't afraid. He wasn't afraid of failure, of making mistakes, or of what others thought of him. He was ready to live life on his own terms. And with Jessica by his side, he knew he wasn't alone. The journey wasn't about perfection, but about progress. And in that moment, Nathan knew that the journey he was on was the one he had been waiting for all his life. It wasn't about the success or the money anymore. It was about the person he had become, and the person he was still becoming. And for the first time he was excited to see where that would take him.